Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and today I'm back with another installment of my complete run madness where I'm going through my complete run of Avengers. And today we're up to a very special block of comics. It's Avengers 251 to 300, and it's very special to me because this is when I started reading comics. It's when I started reading Avengers. So a lot of these have some very personal nostalgia for me. So I also have even more than usual to blather on about. So let's just jump right into it. 251. This is where the Ultimate Vision storyline really starts coming to a head. It's been building in the background for over a year, but it's really culminating here in this run of comics. 252. Hercules gets a new costume here. 253. Well, he doesn't have it yet, but he's going to be getting it shortly. And then 254, Ultimate Vision. This is the end of the Vision storyline. And it's top notch. Top notch. So this is really kind of an important issue. It ends like the first part of the Stern run. It's all been sort of building up to this. And it also ends, for all intents and purposes, it ends the Vision's place in Avengers as one of the main characters, which he's been since issue 57. So Vision was a mainstay on the team from issue 57 all the way to 211. Then he was out of the book for a while they were doing the Yellow Jacket storyline. Came back in 232 or 233. So was only out of the book for about 20 issues and then had this storyline. But in this issue, he removes the control crystal from his head that Ultron put in there, and it changes his personality when he takes it out. This leads into the Vision and the Scarlet Witch miniseries, and that eventually leads into Vision being destroyed by John Byrne. And so when Vision eventually comes back several years later in Avengers, it's the White Vision, who is just a robot with no personality. So the classic Vision that we all love, one of my favorite characters in comics, this is sort of the end of that, which is bittersweet because it's a great storyline, and everything that happened with the character after this was complete garbage. So, I mean, the Englehart run it has its merits, but pretty much they just destroyed the Vision, who was really one of the main characters in one of the main books at Marvel for many, many years, 20 years almost, and then they just destroyed all that. So it's unfortunate. Also wanted to mention, because I didn't really get into this last time, around this time they were having the West Coast Avengers miniseries. It was a little bit before this. What's important about that is when they decided to, Jim Shooter decided to do West Coast Avengers as an ongoing series, which starts up right after this. They didn't tell Roger Stern, and so he had been planning on having West Coast Avengers as a team in Avengers, the title, and so both teams were going to be in here, and he had all these stories worked up with him. And when he suddenly discovered that they were doing this other ongoing book with Steve Englehart that was going to be, that he had no idea what they were doing, had never heard of it, no one told him that they were doing this, he had to scrap over a year's worth of storylines that he had planned out and just come up with new stuff. And we're going to be seeing that actually in the next few issues, because that's basically around the time that the series was coming out. So there's a whole bunch. I don't know what he had planned, but what we're getting here is not originally what was going to be happening in the title. The other thing that's important is we're having a big transition. So that was the last issue of the sort of beginning, the first phase of Roger Stern. The next phase begins here, 255, great Tom Palmer painted cover, but very important interiors now by the legendary John Buscema. Now, I've talked before about how the first part of Stern's run was undermined a little bit by the artwork from Al Milgrom. No offense to Al Milgrom, he's a good storyteller, but it's kind of just the most sort of boring house style that Marvel had at the time. John Buscema, on the other hand, all-time legend. Now, he was kind of doing breakdowns more than full pencils for a lot of this run, as he did a lot towards the end of his career. But Tom Palmer's on inks. Tom Palmer comes in on the inks. So we have this classic legendary team. So Tom Palmer doing his Tom Palmer thing, and the result is just the art just jumps through the roof like overnight. And so first issue with Buscema, and then next issue, to sort of mark that change, we get the new logo. So as I've mentioned, I think this might be the worst Avengers logo they've ever had. This one is also not that great, but it has a lot of nostalgia for me, because not only is this the first with the new logo and the first with a John Buscema cover, right? It was my first issue of Avengers, and that's probably why. It's just such a cool cover from John Buscema. And so I picked this up off the stands. I think this is actually my original copy that I bought off the rack. You can see I've since had it signed by Roger Stern. Now, there's two different storylines going on here. This begins a story where Captain Marvel, Captain Monica, goes off into space on a mission, and the main team is going to the Savage Land, and we get some first appearances here. First appearance of Terminus, but also in the other storyline, this is the first appearance of Nebula, which is going to get very confusing over the course of this run. But Nebula, the character who in the comics is originally described as Thanos' granddaughter, in the movies, of course, is Thanos' daughter. First appearance here, very different character in the comics, and going to be very different with some very confusing elements, as we're going to talk about shortly. Firelord shows up. This is a crossover with Spider-Man 270, Amazing Spider-Man 270, which I don't think I realized at the time, although we see Spider-Man here. Quick side note, it's fitting that they have a crossover with the Avengers, because Spider-Man 270, where Spider-Man fights Firelord, the cover is an homage. I don't think it's noted as such, a swipe of the classic Neil Adams cover for Avengers 96. We get this storyline. So the Avengers go up into space to meet up with Captain Marvel. They get involved with this whole thing with Nebula going on. The Skrulls are there. This leads into Avengers Annuals 14, which was a kind of a cheesy crossover with the Fantastic Four Annual at the same time, where they had about half of the issue was the same story, but from the other perspective. So if you got both of them, you kind of got robbed of half of your story. But I love these covers. It feels like, classic Kree Skrull War. John Buscema's back on the book. Like, it just has that feel. Here's a Nebula on the cover. And here's where things start getting undermined by the company-wide crossovers. I talked a little bit about this last time. There was sort of an unlabeled company-wide crossover with ROM leading into ROM 65 and 66. They had the Dire Wraiths and ROM appeared in several titles, X-Men most notably, but also in Avengers, among other places. But they hadn't gotten to the point where these company-wide crossovers were being branded, right? So here we have a Secret Wars 2 crossover that's actually branded as a crossover, and it's really intrusive. The next issue as well, 261, where the Beyonder suddenly shows up right in the middle of the storyline, and basically messes up the whole plot. So you have this plot that's been going on in Avengers that seems to be building to this big climax, and then the Beyonder shows up, and that completely short circuits that plot. The Avengers come back from space. We don't find out what happens. Star Fox leaves the team to try and chase down Nebula. Don't know. Doesn't matter anymore. Goodbye storyline, because we have to deal with the freaking Beyonder Secret Wars 2, which was a total dumpster fire. So that was disappointing. 262, Stern brings Namor the Submariner joins the Avengers in this issue. He's not on the team for very long, but again, these were the issues where I first started reading. So for me, Namor joining the team is sort of this classic moment. He feels like an Avenger. Interesting trivia side note, I guess. We have Namor fighting Hercules on the cover by John Buscema, and Buscema did a cover with the two of them facing off in Avengers number 40. So that's a cool throwback. Speaking of company-wide events, here's Avengers 263, which is where the story begins, where Jean Grey returns from the dead, setting up X Factor, and it's got the X Factor thing here, and I think that was, in retrospect, kind of the end of X-Men as a sort of vital creative series. It basically just began the ruination of the X franchise, because they started turning into a franchise. We get X Factor and X Force and like all these different titles. I mean, they already had New Mutants, but it just gets watered down so much, and all the characters spread out so much, and the creative team spread out so much, that it really goes downhill. And just bringing back Jean Grey sort of is the death knell of death meaning anything in the Marvel Universe. So not an auspicious issue. I will say there's something really cool in this issue that I like a lot, which is that Captain America is an artist. It rarely comes up, but in his own book at the same time, he was actually drawing Captain America for Marvel Comics, which was fun. That was his like day job. And there's a cool part in here where someone's describing something, and Cap uses his like it's almost like a court artist, he sketches out from the description what the person was talking about. It was just a cool moment. 264, we get the first appearance of the new Yellow Jacket, a character that I thought they were going to do more with. A lot of these copies are my original copies. In fact, almost all of these are the original copies that I bought off of the spinner rack back in the day. 265. Again, we get the Beyonder. And then maybe the best part of Secret Wars was actually this. It's the epilogue issue. So if you've read Secret Wars 2, but you haven't read Avengers 266, you haven't got the whole story. Because basically everything's left in ruin. The Earth is basically damaged by the big fight with Beyonder at the end. And Molecule Man, they have to talk Molecule Man into basically reconstructing the Earth using his powers. I like the Molecule Man stuff, because the Molecule Man story, 215, 216, all-time classic. So that's a really good issue. The best part of Secret Wars 2. But again, this whole section of the run is very disjointed, because it's constantly being interrupted by crap from other titles. X-Force, Secret Wars, like all this stuff. All right, here's a book that's been getting a lot of attention recently. It's Kang. This is the first appearance of the Cross-Time Council, the Council of Cross-Time Kangs. It's really not, but it kind of is. But this has been getting a lot of attention in the lead up to Phase 5 in Marvel, which is all going to be about Kang and the multiverse. There's a lot of stuff that's been taken from this storyline. Kang's my favorite character. This was my introduction to him. That issue 267, I never really read anything with alternate universes or anything. I have rarely been so confused reading a comic than the beginning of this, where Storm and Colossus are on the Avengers, and then Kang, who's disguised as Iron Man, sets off a nuke and blows up all of New York. And then another Kang shows up and executes him. And I had no idea what was happening. But I struggled through, and eventually Kang became my favorite supervillain. 268. There's a cool part in this where they're in limbo and they see an unconscious space phantom on the ground, and it starts turning into Avengers, and they realize that time doesn't exist in limbo, and they're seeing from the other side of limbo their encounter with Space Phantom from Avengers #2. So that was cool. Here's Kang fighting Immortus, and this is an issue where Ravonna ends up betraying and killing Kang because the Ravonna who has been in, it's an alternate world Ravonna, of course, because of Ravonna in our timelines died. But in another timeline, she was survived, but she's with Immortus because Immortus is the best part of Kang, supposedly. 270, here's a cool issue where Namor is like put on trial for his crimes against humanity for all the times he tried to destroy New York with giant whales. It also has this fight here, Wasp fighting Moonstone. This begins the Mansion Siege storyline. A lot of times I've seen like people basically beginning that storyline with 273, but it actually starts here, and particularly in the next issue, 271, which guest stars Paladin. This is all about the Masters of Evil sort of being formed. So these are important to this storyline. 272, we get another side quest crossover with Alpha Flight, and Namor ends up leaving the team. This is where he really gets involved with Marina. I don't know, I don't like the undersea stuff. But here's where the good stuff really gets going. Okay, all-time classic, my favorite Avengers storyline. I have a lot of nostalgia for it, plus it's also just awesome. It's the Mansion Siege. And it starts off with the Marvel 25th anniversary cover, which I think is by Tom Palmer. Black Knight looks quite old here. But we get the classic frame cover dated November 1986. So this would have been on sale early fall. I've talked about this issue before, 274. This is where the Masters of Evil take over Avengers Mansion at the end. They have a big pig pile on Hercules, who they've gotten super drunk beforehand, to the point where he's just sort of staggering around. And they just like absolutely beat him almost to death. So at the end of this issue, it looks like he's died, and so it teases the next issue and says even a god can die. And of course, as a kid, not realizing how these things work, I thought he was dead. And my friend Jason and I used to talk every Friday night after New Comic Book Day, which was on Fridays at the time, about the comics we had gotten. And I just remember being like, oh my goodness, I can't believe it. And the month wait until issue 275. that's the waiting month to month that we talk about, that we used to have. That's the time I really remember it, is waiting for issue 275. So here's 275. We get Scott Lang, Ant-Man. Basically, Wasp is like the only member of the team left as she starts calling in the reserves. Dr. Druid ends up showing up to help the team here, which is going to turn out in the long run to be an unfortunate addition to things, because he's kind of a dope. And then the classic 277 final battle. You can see I have mine signed here by Roger Stern. Just all-timer. Such a great storyline. If you haven't read it, I won't spoil it for you any more than I already have. 278. So She-Hulk's back on the team now. Of course, she had been on the team. I talked about this before. She joined the team in issue 221. Her series had just been, solo series had just been canceled. Joined the team in 221. Was on the team until Secret Wars. Secret War, she joins Fantastic Four. She's with Fantastic Four, and then when she leaves Fantastic Four, she's immediately added back to Avengers. So if you collect She-Hulk specifically, you can follow her month to month, even though she doesn't have her own book again. 279. This is a cool, there's action in it, but it's really a character piece about Captain Marvel, Captain Monica. This culminates this arc that Roger Stern's been setting up since when he first introduced Captain Monica in Amazing Spider-Man Annual 16, that immediately led into her joining the Avengers in Avengers 227 as a recruit. She's a member in training, right? Because she's a new superhero doesn't know how her powers work, has never been in a superhero situation. So they're bringing her along. And so from issue 227 to 279, over 50 issues, she's slowly learned about being a superhero. She became a full-time member, I think, in issue 255 when they sent her off into space. I think that was her mission to prove that she was ready to be a full-time member. So in this issue, she ends up becoming the chairman of the team. And this is going to turn out to be a huge bone of contention, which I'm going to get into in a minute because it's infuriating. But so, I mean, there's people that aren't a big fan of Captain Monica because they feel like she's a pet character. But I think anyone who calls her Mary Sue is completely missing it, because there's a whole huge arc over many years showing her slow development from an untrained novice with no idea what she's doing to become the leader of the Avengers. And it's a great arc. It's also, one thing that Stern has done throughout the run is, because she's new to everything, she's the reader's eyes. She's the stand-in for us as a reader in this situation. So I'm and obviously I'm nostalgia because this is the era I started in, but I think she's a great character, and it was perfectly fitting for her to take over as the team leader, and that's only going to last for a couple issues for reasons I'm going to get into in a minute. 280 is a one-off. Jarvis had been seriously injured in the Mansion Siege. This is a Jarvis solo story, but it's also a history of the whole Avengers run, because it starts with him remembering the team forming and going through all sort of their major moments and his major moments. One great thing about this issue, which of course I had no idea about at the time, but here's some trivia. Here's some super deep nerd trivia for you. Some of the stuff in this, when we're talking about Jarvis' past, is stuff that had not been in the comics before, right? But it had been revealed before. In Foom number 6, so Foom, the Friends of Old Marvel newsletter magazine that was sent to members of the official Marvel fan club in the 1970s. Foom number 6 was the first part of a two-part Avengers-centric focus. So Foom 6 and 7 were both all about the Avengers. Foom number 6, the cover of it, I should have gotten it out to show you, but it's a Jarvis. It's got Jarvis on the cover, and the idea is that the issue has an interview with Jarvis. So it's a text feature where the journalist is interviewing Jarvis, and he talks about Avengers history. Some of the stuff in that text interview in Foom 6 with Jarvis is stuff that had never been in the comics, but it's in this. So this issue actually puts into official canon some of the Jarvis interview from Foom number 6 from 1974. Anyway, a little bit of trivia, but I thought that was really cool. So we get into a 5-part storyline here. We start to get some of these 5-part arcs. It's very modern, even though this is the late 80s. At this point, we're in like 1988, I think, 87, 88. We get these 5 issue arcs for a little bit, which feels very much like writing for the trade. It's very ahead of its time, although there's a lot more happening in these. This is a cool storyline where basically Zeus blames the Avengers for the catastrophic injuries that his son Hercules has suffered, and he decides he's gonna like basically trash them. And there's some really cool stuff in this storyline. Here's 282, 283. The coolest part here is basically Thor is trapped, and Thor wasn't even involved in that story, right? He came in as a reserve after Hercules was already out of the picture. But Thor is basically trapped in hell by or the underworld, whatever, by Pluto, and the Avengers free him from like this, like, you know, castle in hell, and they have to fight their way up. It's really cool. 284 and 285. Now, this is an important issue for me, from my perspective, because for me, I didn't love the end of the story. I thought the art by Buscema actually let things down a little bit, but I'm not sure how much else they could have done. Because there's a part where Zeus is about to kill the Avengers or whatever, and a mysterious figure shows up to fight him, and is like, we're supposed to convey that, like, it's supposed to convey that Zeus is like consumed with rage to the point where he is blinded by it. And so, but they try and keep this reveal of who the mystery figure is secret from us as well. So he's done entirely in silhouette in panels where there's no reason why he should be blacked out. And so it's Hercules, of course, has come to, and he's trying to stop his father from killing his friends. But it just fell flat for me. But what's important here is, this is a storyline that I only thought was okay at the time, but has definitely grown in my estimation since. For me, Avengers was consistently one of, if not the best books at Marvel or anywhere for the first 25 years of its run. So starting with issue 1 in 1963, running to this issue. So for me, the first 285 issues of Avengers, yeah, obviously there's parts that are better or worse, but it's consistently excellent up until this issue. Then we start the next 5-part storyline. And this is all about a group of robots. 286, 287, and here's where we run into problems. Mark Gruenwald, late great Mark Gruenwald, who I'm a big fan of, made probably the biggest mistake of his professional career here, because there's a massive conflict of interest. Sorry for those of you who know all this, if I'm treading over ground that you don't want to talk about, or if this is boring, but for those of you who haven't heard this story, Mark Gruenwald's the editor of Avengers. He was also the writer on Captain America. He believed, and I think he like legitimately believed this. He believed that both Avengers and Captain America would sell better if Captain America was the leader of Avengers. He felt like Captain America should be the center of the Avengers as a team. And he also felt that would boost the sales of Avengers, and it would have a carryover effect on his own title, Captain America, and boost the sales on Captain America as well. So he basically, this is my understanding, is he gave Roger Stern an ultimatum and said, you have to make Captain America the leader of the Avengers. Now, as I just talked about, Roger Stern has spent 5 years doing this character arc from rookie to leader for Captain Marvel, and had just made her leader, and he had spent his entire time on Avengers setting this up. She just became leader. Now, I don't know how the details, but what I've been told is that my understanding is that Grunwald specifically wanted in the story it shown that Captain America should be leader of Avengers because he's a better leader than anybody else, i.e. Captain Marvel. And, you know, I've heard versions of this where he basically said that he wanted Captain Marvel to fail and be embarrassed and Captain America had to take over. I don't know exactly how firm that was, but that was the gist. He not only wanted Captain America to become leader, he wanted Captain America to become leader at the expense of Captain Marvel. And Stern refused to do it and quit the title, which is a huge shame because this run's great, right? And it destabilizes the book, and the book, as far as I'm concerned, never recovers from this. We had this 25 years of greatness, and this, again, the huge conflict of interest for Grunwald trying to boost the sales of his own title that he's writing over here by exercising his power as editor. So, as a temporary measure, I can't remember if it's Fabian or I think it's Fabian who takes over as writer here. And the end of the story is pretty good. Basically, it turns out these robots are all being gathered together by the super adaptoid who has gained sentience, and he's trying to replace all the people on Earth with adaptoids. And has this great ending where Captain America, who's now the captain, because it's during that period, where he basically tricks the adaptoid, and he was like, you can copy humans, but you can never be human because you're a robot, so you're immortal. And what makes people human is that they're mortal, that they die. And the adaptoid's like, oh yeah, I can adapt anything, I'll prove it. And he's like, I can die, and he drops dead. That's the end of the story. So so the story is really cool, but what they do is they bring in Walt Simonson. So they bring in Walt Simonson. Now, I'm a huge Walt Simonson fan, and Walt Simonson clearly has a vision for Avengers. He has a big story that he wants to tell. And in order to get there, he first has to completely destroy the team, right? So that's what starts happening in this issue, 291. Marina goes crazy. She turns into this giant sea monster. And during this battle, Captain Marvel is seriously injured. She basically depletes all of her power. And so she can't continue as a member of the Avengers or the leader of the Avengers. There is a bit in here where she's like so traumatized by this battle that she seems like she just can't go on as a superhero. And I feel like that's the moment, you know, editorially dictated, where we see that she's not cut out for this, so Captain America has to take over, except Captain America doesn't take over yet, because this is a slow burn. Here's that issue again. So 294, Dr. Druid takes over. Now, here's where things get super confusing. The big storyline that Walt Simonson wants to tell has to do with Kang and the Council of Cross-Time Kangs. We saw a little tiny version of them in the Roger Stern run, but here we have a much bigger version, which is all across the multiverse. In the Stern story, it seemed like all the Kangs had been destroyed by Immortus because they were causing too much havoc in the timelines. But in here, we basically find out that, you know, the universe is infinite. So while there are these different pockets of realities where all the Kangs have been destroyed by their versions of Immortus, there's also some Kangs that have survived. And because things are, again, infinite, there's like hundreds and hundreds of Kangs that survived, even though there's been millions of Kangs that have been killed. And they have this council to keep each other in check. And one of the people on the council is Nebula. And this is so confusing because Nebula, it seems like it's Nebula, who we've just met. She looks like Nebula because she's also blue. But eventually, she's a Kang. She like infiltrates the Kang organization, and becomes a Kang. It seems like I don't remember how it works, but it seemed like she like killed the Kang and took his armor and like sneaks into the group or whatever. Eventually, it's decided at some point that this is not Nebula. It's just a character who's called Nebula, or it's an alternate world Nebula who becomes Kang. But this is not at all clear in the story. So when I was reading this, the last time we saw Nebula, she was being chased by Star Fox. All of a sudden, 20 issues later, she's Kang, and there's no explanation, and it's super confusing. But what happens here is she basically uses mind control to influence Dr. Druid, and he uses mind control to influence the Avengers. He starts making She-Hulk become more Hulk-like, so she starts sort of going berserk and going crazy, and the Black Knight's being affected by the curse of the Ebony Blade, and he basically ends up mind controlling the whole team in this storyline. And at the end of the storyline, Nebula is defeated, Dr. Druid is defeated, they're freed sort of from their mind control, but the few Avengers that are there, they don't trust each other, and they all have their own things to do, particularly Thor, and they end up disbanding the team completely. Right? So this is all set up. Keep in mind, this is all set up. Then we get a 3-part Inferno crossover. Now, it does start with 298. Now, there's no Avengers at the moment, right? So the whole issue is a Jarvis solo story where Jarvis is dealing with Inferno. And this is actually the best part of Inferno by far. Because let me tell you, I was reading all the X titles at the time. I read all the Inferno crossovers. Inferno sucks. It has always sucked. It's garbage. I know that it's crazy to me that in the last 10 or 15 years it's been like some Inferno nostalgia. They brought back the Inferno. They did another Inferno event because the people working at Marvel were people that grew up reading Inferno, and so they were impressionable, dumb children who thought it was good, and they had to add. Then they actually brought that crap back. But Inferno is horrible. This is the best part of Inferno, right here. And so there's no Avengers, but there's this big catastrophic event going on, right? And so there needs to be an Avengers. So at the end of that issue, the Captain shows up and he decides, I'm going to reform the Avengers. And so at the same time, from the pages of X-Force, X-Factor, which Simonson had been working on with his wife, we get the Orphan Maker. And Orphan Maker shows up and trying to kidnap like Franklin Richards or something. And so Sue and Reed get involved and blah, blah, blah. Long story short, at the end of all of that, we get the weirdest Avengers team of all time. It's the Captain, because he's still not back to being Captain America, although Captain America 350, where he becomes Captain America again, same month as this book. But the Captain, Mr. Fantastic, the Invisible Woman, Thor, and Gilgamesh the Forgotten One. That's the team. So this is what Walt Simonson's been building up to. He has all these plans with the Fantastic Four, because he's always wanted to write them. And at that time, Reed and Sue weren't in the Fantastic Four. They had gone on, they'd taken a break, and so Thing was leading his own team of Fantastic Four. So Walt Simonson was told, okay, you can use them in Avengers. That's the whole reason he took Avengers on. That was a big part of it. They promised him he could use Mr. Fantastic and Invisible Woman. And so he's setting up this giant Kang storyline. And this is going to be the Avengers team because he wants to have Mr. Fantastic and Invisible Woman. That's his whole plan, right? Well, this is his last issue. He spends 10 issues setting this up, and what happens? Well, I'll tell you what happens. Another editorial interference where all of a sudden they tell him, actually, we can't do that. Just like they had decided that Captain America had to be the leader of the Avengers for corporate reasons, not story reasons, but corporate reasons. They suddenly reversed course and say, well, Mr. Fantastic and Invisible Woman are Fantastic Four characters. It's really weird for them to be wearing Fantastic Four costumes in the Avengers, first of all. But they can't be in Avengers because we need them to be for branding reasons in the Fantastic Four. And so Simonson's like, hey, I took this whole book on because you said that I could use them, and I want to use these characters. And now you're completely pulling the rug out from under me. And so what they did was they were like, okay, how about you take over Fantastic Four? Then you can write the stories you want with Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman, but it'll just be in Fantastic Four. And so Simonson's like, okay. So Simonson goes over to Fantastic Four. Reed and Sue quit the Avengers almost immediately, which we'll talk about in the next batch of issues, but they're only on the team for like one issue or one small storyline. And then they go over there. Simonson leaves the book immediately, and this whole giant Kang storyline, which he's been setting up here, ends up taking place in Fantastic Four. So Kang, who's always been the Avengers' #1 archenemy, has one of his biggest storylines ever in the pages of Fantastic Four because of editorial stupidity. And once again, it's Avengers as a title that suffers from it because we lose Simonson. I've never read that storyline because I don't read Fantasy Four and I wasn't reading it at the time, but from all accounts, it's supposed to be a really excellent storyline. And so while the good stuff is happening over in the Fantastic Four, we get what we're going to be getting for the next several years of Avengers, which is subpar stuff. And again, it's just editors screwing it up. So Simonson spends 10 issues destroying the team and rebuilding it for his specific purpose, and then immediately is taken off the book. New writers come in who don't want this team, and it's just a jumbled freaking disaster. So I know some people that consider the classic era Avengers to run up through issue 300 and end here, but for me 285 is where it ends, because halfway through the next storyline things get derailed by editorial interference, and we just get more and more messes after that. And so even though these storylines are interesting and they're good because Simonson's good, they ultimately don't fix anything or go anywhere because they're ruined once again. Now, one thing I wanted to mention real quick, because I forgot to tell you this. My copy is signed by Walt Simonson here, and is signed by Stan Lee right here. When I met Stan Lee in 1989, this had just come out, and I thought, symmetry. I'll have him sign Avengers 1 and Avengers 300. Now, of course, that's no longer symmetry, because we've had 400 and 500 and 600 and 700. But it actually still makes sense because, people may not know this, there's actually a Stan Lee story in this issue. This is one of the rare late Stan Lee writing jobs that he was doing very occasionally at the time. There's a backup story here where it's Loki marking the anniversary of the Avengers creation in Avengers #1, his greatest failure, creating the Avengers unintentionally. And that's written by Stan Lee with art by Walt Simonson. So Simonson's doing the writing on the main story with art by John Buscema and Tom Palmer. But the backup story, Stan Lee script, Walt Simonson pencils. And so that's why I've got Stan Lee's signature on there and Walt Simonson's. So that's it. Talked about this plenty. I told you I was going to have a lot to say. Avengers 251 to 300. So thanks very much for watching. Let me know what you think down below. I'll see you next time.